you come away from Canada after having been taught and trained how to react in times of war, and suddenly you find that that pistol must remain in your holster for the whole time unless your life is actually threatened. It is a whole different concept. It's a whole different way of doing things. You've got to stand there and be abused by people, and you want to do something to correct the situation, and all you've got really is the kindness in your eyes and the tone of your voice to try and establish a calm situation. Our squadron was made up of very, very young men. First time away from home, many of them had only been in the Army 18 months. And it was a time where there was only 107 of us, and we became like brothers to one another. And if one fellow was having an extra rough time and didn't get any mail, well, what the hell? You'd give him your letter and let him read that, at least so that he had something, a tie with home.
A good soldier inevitably makes a good peacekeeper, because the traits he's taught as a soldier in his disciplined approach to society, to the use of arms, and to the respect for arms and their use, help him very much in peacekeeping. He needs patience. He needs to be a good listener. He needs to demonstrate a sympathy and a humanity. He must be able to establish a credibility with the confronting soldiers on the ground. He must not be easily misled or bluffed. He must appreciate that he carries out a very responsible operation with particular reference to his reporting, because it's on him that the judgments are made at the higher levels. It's the accuracy of his reporting of incidents are reflected in, eventually, decisions in the Security Council. My first exposure to the UN was in 1961 in the Congo as a company commander with the 36th Irish Battalion operating in Elizabethville. That was very early in the UN use of peacekeeping forces in operation. Now, Congo is a huge country, major logistical problems, a confused political situation, mutinies by the local military forces, etc. So the situation was extremely confused, and very much so for a young Irish company commander in that operation.
The Belgian Congo, now the nation of Zaire, came to independence amid a nationalist movement that has swept through Africa. By 1960, 17 African nations had gained independence. Dag Hammarskjöld viewed the United Nations as a midwife in this process, helping these countries become self-sufficient, while insulating them from the competing interests and ideologies of the major powers.
We are at the turn of the road where our attitude will be of decisive significance, I believe, not only for the future of this organization, but also for the future of Africa. And Africa may well, in present circumstances, mean the world.
Violence and chaos in the Congo. Barely 11 days after official independence from Belgium, Congolese troops mutinied and began a wave of attacks and looting throughout the far-flung sectors of the former colony.
The first Congolese government, a fragile coalition consisting of the charismatic Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba and President Joseph Kasavubu, was faced with widespread disorder and violence. Desperately seeking a way to end the chaos, Prime Minister Lumumba turned to the United States.
Lumumba wanted military assistance. He wanted a military base to cope with the essentially military problems of law and order to the extent that he ever could in the Congo. And the first person he turned to was President Eisenhower and asked for American military help. And Eisenhower's reply was a determinant, really, for what happened. He said, "We will not give you any American help. You have got to get any help you need from the United Nations."
On July 14, 1960, the Security Council authorized the Secretary General to implement an operation. From Ghana, Morocco, Ethiopia, Tunisia, Ireland, and Sweden, troops converged on the Congo. For many of these soldiers, this was their first experience serving outside their home countries. Eventually, 26 countries contributed some 20,000 troops to the operation. UNUC, as the mission was called, was the most complex the United Nations had undertaken, and would test Hammarskjöld's vision of an activist UN.
We got into the Congo literally overnight, one hot evening in July 1960. And the reason was that the Congo was one of the largest, most important strategically and economically. It was an immensely important country. It came to independence with no preparation. And the moment the Belgians declared independence, the place simply dissolved in total chaos. The army had mutinied. It had thrown out its Belgian officers. There were no Congolese officers, and it had simply mutinied and taken to the bush. And this was creating a tremendous problem in any towns, and the civilians were all frightened. And we managed to mobilize a train with a battalion of Moroccans to try to get the soldiers back to camp and under orders of some kind again. We put a blue flag on the front of the engine, but what was nice was that the Congolese had never heard of the UN at all. They had no idea, and in fact one of the local commissioners, it was called ONU in French, he said, "L'ONU c'est quelle tribu? What tribe is the United Nations?"
Many people in our country had not seen so many different types of people from around the world. We have Ghanaians and Irish and Swedes and so on. So it's quite exciting having all these people in the country. And also knowing that many of these people were genuinely interested in helping us to establish peace and consolidate our independence. So it was kind of exciting. Certainly later on we were disappointed some of the things that the UN was doing. But in the beginning, we were kind of very hopeful about the UN presence in the country.
Hammarskjöld flew to the Congo, joining Ralph Bunche. Together, they met with members of Prime Minister Lumumba's government. A major concern was the secession of the Congo's wealthiest province, mineral-rich Katanga. Katanga's leader, Moise Tshombe, with the backing of conservative Belgian mining interests, had removed Katanga from the control of the central government. Strong disagreements regarding UN policy also developed between Hammarskjöld and Lumumba.
One of the main problems was a difference of opinion as to what the UN mandate in the Congo was. For Lumumba, and Lumumba is the one who had called in the UN, for him the UN was there to help the central government expel Belgian troops and help the country regain the Katanga province. Dag Hammarskjöld, on the other hand, saw his mission as simply reestablishing law and order.
Lumumba had no idea how the UN works. He wanted the UN troops to invade with his troops. Well, we were not there as an invading force. The UN was there, UN troops were there as a peacekeeping force. The UN simply could not accept that task. He couldn't understand why we could not accept that task.
A frustrated Lumumba turned to the Soviet Union for aid and began his own military campaign against Katanga. This new alliance frightened the Western powers and plunged the Congo into the icy waters of the Cold War.
The United States deplores the unilateral action of the Soviet Union in supplying aircraft and other equipment for military purposes to the Congo.
Hammarskjöld and the Western powers now considered Lumumba irresponsible and dangerous. In a move to eliminate Lumumba, the United States and its allies threw their support behind Congolese President Joseph Kasavubu, who formed an alliance with the army chief Joseph Mobutu, and on September 5, 1960, dismissed Lumumba as prime minister. Lumumba refused to step down. Fearing an outbreak of hostilities between rival factions, the United Nations took steps critics claim undermined the prime minister, most notably closing the national radio station an international airport in Leopoldville. The Soviets, initial supporters of the UN operation, now accused Hammarskjöld of siding with the West. This position was forcefully articulated by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev at the opening of the General Assembly in the fall of 1960.
Khrushchev denounced Hammarskjöld as a man who was in the pay of, in league with the Western powers. He proposed that in place of a single Secretary General, that there be a troika, that there be 3 people as in the office of Secretary General, representing the Soviet Union and its camp, the Western world, and the Third World. And this, of course, was a monstrosity which Hammarskjöld refused to bow to.
By resigning, I would therefore, at the present difficult and dangerous juncture, throw the organization to the winds.
There was a famous episode, I remember watching it from a booth, the CBS booth overlooking the General Assembly, where, having earlier hammered his fists on the table to demonstrate his objections to various points in the debate, he took off his shoe, his old brown shoe, and beat it on the table.
We, doing our best in the Congo, found ourselves actually in this real nutcracker between East and West. Everything you did was interpreted on the outside as taking sides on one side or the other. The fact that what you were trying to do was to get the poor old Congo onto its feet again and get people living normal lives was completely ruled out. It became an East-West obsession.
A new chapter begins in the dark and tragic history of the Congo with the return to Leopoldville of deposed Premier Lumumba, following his capture by crack commandos of strongman Colonel Mobutu. Public abuse of the controversial figure was followed by his close confinement in Katanga province. As Lumumba's followers raised the threat of civil war, the news came that he had been slain.
There were demonstrations in many of the world's capitals, and it broke out in the Security Council as well. I happened to be there. The meeting was in progress. The question of Lumumba came up, and there was sort of a minor riot broke out.
While Mobutu and Kasavubu consolidated their hold on the Congo, the Katanga secession was gaining momentum. Katangi's leader, Moise Tshombe, had amassed a small mercenary army, and United Nations soldiers were increasingly coming under attack. Hammarskjöld turned to the Security Council for help. In a highly controversial decision, the Security Council amended its original Congo resolution. United Nations troops were authorized to use force if necessary to expel mercenary troops and deal with the impending civil war.
I was 27 years old. I was a reporter there, and the UN had a polyglot of forces. It had Ethiopian troops, a lot of Indian troops, Gurkha troops, and one day I awoke to the sound of machine guns, and it was the UN crushing the Katanga secession. I'd always wanted to be a war correspondent, and much to my surprise, I had become one. And this is part of what I filed. Before dawn, the United Nations Command sent one company of Indian Gurkhas to seize the post office in the center of the city, which houses communications. The Gurkhas, accompanied by armored cars, dashed into an alley and entered the building, and then fought their way from room to room, hurling grenades and firing submachine guns. As the fight was still raging, a reporter telephoned the post office. The Katangese replied, "We are all dying." It was very bloody. I mean, it was quite shocking to a young man at that moment.
We, in our unit, were launched into that operation. And the first part of that operation for our battalion was a battle for a tunnel in the entrance to Elizabethville. I was the company commander committed to that. That was the first time in my life I came under fire, under mortar fire, small arms fire. A little frightening, you know. And one has an anxiety as to how you're going to react to such a situation, because on your reaction depends very much on what your men are going to do.
The battle for the tunnel lasted hours, but the fight to end the Katanga secession would take another year. As negotiations dragged on and casualties mounted, the United Nations found itself in a very uncomfortable position. What started out as a peacekeeping operation was on the verge of becoming an all-out war.
While with the UN Indian troops in Katanga, Movietone cameraman Ernest Christie, in these exclusive films, recorded a startling drama. A tragedy caused when a driver, ordered to halt, speeded up and drew a deadly fire. A wife slumps to her death beside her husband, Albert Verbrugge of Belgium, as Verbrugge, badly wounded, staggers from his car to beg that the shooting cease.
The cost of Congolese reunification was extensive. After 4 years of fighting, thousands of Congolese and 237 UN troops had died in the struggle. The most prominent casualty was the Secretary General himself. While en route to meet Tshombe in an attempt to negotiate an end to the fighting in Katanga, Hammarskjöld's plane crashed, leaving no survivors.
I know that I'm speaking for all of my fellow Americans, expressing our deep sense of shock and loss in the untimely death of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Dag Hammarskjöld.
Hammarskjöld's successor, U Thant, a soft-spoken diplomat from Burma, continued the policy of active intervention in the Congo. In January 1963, Tshombe finally agreed to end the secession. 11 months later, United Nations troops began leaving the Congo.
The Congo example teaches us many things. The major powers which were prepared to go along with an activist Secretary General rapidly discovered that their interests were not being served as they each thought they would be served, and the Soviets fell off the team very early on, and in fact they began to refuse to contribute to any peacekeeping operations, largely on the basis of the, quote, illegality, unquote, of the Congo operation.
It was a very, very difficult operation, and I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't attempted it. I'm not sure. I think the results would have been pretty bad. And of course, it had a lasting effect on the political situation in the UN. It had an enormously inhibiting effect on the office of the Secretary General, and it did, for some 25 years, make it very difficult to mount peacekeeping operations, because we had the constant accusation that we were exceeding our authority, that we were acting too independently, and so on.
If I may say so, the UN depends on 3 M's for the peacekeeping operations. There's money, men, and materials. If we don't get these 3 M's, I think the future of the UN is, if I may say so, quite gloomy.
25 years later, money, men, and materials remain the problem for the United Nations. Without a standing army of its own, the UN has to rely on member nations to contribute soldiers, materials, and money. These troops have mostly come from the non-aligned and neutral nations, frequently the only ones acceptable to all parties in a conflict. Often it has been even more difficult to obtain the materials necessary to keep an operation going.
The wood was procured locally from Namibian sources. It's been stored by the Polish depot here for the week. It's being loaded on a truck supplied by the UK, driven by a Canadian. Tomorrow it'll be loaded on an aircraft which is controlled by the Italian and Spanish forces and be delivered to Angola for the monitors that are up there.
All these troops serve in their own units with their own officers, but under the direction of a force commander, who is appointed by the Secretary General. But the fuel that keeps the engine running is money. And getting member nations to pay their dues has always been a serious problem, particularly when the withholding of funds has been used as a political weapon. After the 1956 Suez Crisis, France refused to pay its